What's up everybody, welcome back. So part 2 in our Guard AI series, and we're gonna continue doing a little bit of setup, but it's going to be a bit more exciting than the last video. We're gonna set up the weapon system for the AI, or at least the base for the weapon system, and we're gonna be using data assets for that. So I haven't been using data assets a lot in my tutorials, although they're not really new anymore. So we're also going to be talking a little bit about why we would use a data asset instead of a data table and what the benefits may be. So that's going to be in today's video. If you like the series, please consider leaving a like. And if you want to get the project files for yourself to download, you can become a YouTube member or a Patreon, and then you will get access to premium channels in the Discord and also download for the project files. So with all of that stuff out of the way, let's dive into today's video. Before we start working on the weapon setup, there are a few small things I want to look at from the previous video. So as you saw at the end of the little introduction, the turn in place animations actually stopped working, and I actually messed up a few small things on the animation blueprint. So I'm sorry, but we're gonna fix that right away. So the first thing, if we are in the event graph, we have our update animation event. We check the bools for turning left, turning right, and we want to follow the through branch till the end. And over here, we're setting our use turn 180 animation boolean. And I accidentally hooked it up to the wrong branches. So over here, I hooked it up to the lower branch that sets both of the booleans back to false. And we don't want to hook it up over here. We actually want to hook it up to the two upper branches, where we set one of the two turn animations to play to true. So you want to make sure that the branch that comes from the speed check that equals 0, that's connected to the false pin. This branch doesn't need to have the use turn 180 animation bool hooked up. It only needs to set these bools back to false. So this is how it should look. And then if we go down a little over here, after the do once node, we set our current yaw and our target yaw. Just to make sure, I want to add a normalize access in between here. So this doesn't really break anything, but I just want to make sure it's in here. So just add it in between here and then set the target yaw from the normalized access node. So just a little failsafe over here. And there is one small thing that is actually a mistake. If we go into the state machine, and in here we have the transitions between turning left and turning right, and I accidentally swapped those over. So if we go from turning right to turning left, our is turning left boolean needs to be true, and I set it up with is turning right. So we want to make sure that we swap the booleans for these two transitions. So over here, this needs to be is turning left because we are entering the turning left transition or state. And this one needs to be is turning right. So if we set it up like this, then it should work a little bit smoother. I'm sorry about this. So this usually happens if I'm looking at my notes while I'm also recording something. So a bit sloppy, but this should fix it. So now we're good to go to start setting up our weapon, and the first thing we need is a skeleton on, a socket on our skeleton so we can adjust the position of the weapon. So let's open up our character, and if we double click the skeletal mesh asset, it will open the skeleton. In here we want to make sure that we have the skeleton tree opened, and we want to go to the preview scene settings. So for the preview controller, we want to set it to a user specific animation, so we can play an idle animation in here, for example. So let's look for the idle rifle hip animation. And I'm gonna stop playing it, so it's a little bit easier to adjust the weapon if it's not moving. And then we want to select the hand R bone over here. We're going to right click and add a socket to the hand R bone. So we can rename it if we want to. So for example, hand R weapon socket. And then we're going to attach the weapon to this socket so we can see how we need to adjust the position. So if we right click, we can add a preview asset, and then we can add one of the weapons. So the assault rifle, for example. And then we can simply use the widgets in the viewport to adjust the location over here. So I already set up the location in my example project, and I'm gonna copy the location and the rotation. So let me quickly grab those, copy from here, and then paste it in here. So I have it set to minus 9.3, then 5.35, and minus 3.73. And then for the rotation on the z-axis, I'm gonna set it to 95 degrees. So these can be 0, that's fine. So now we have the weapon socket pretty much positioned, and we're gonna remove the preview asset again, otherwise it will also show up in our animation blueprint preview and all of those blueprints, so that's a little bit annoying. So we're gonna simply remove all attached assets, and that's done. So we can save the skeleton and we have our socket in place. The next thing I want to do is set up an enumeration that we're going to use for the weapons. So we're going to create a few files that we need to set up the weapon system. So I'm going to create a separate folder for that. So let's call the folder weapons, and then inside of the weapons folder I'm going to create a data folder. So in there I'm going to put all the quote-unquote support blueprints, and in here I'm going to put all the actual weapons that we can use on the character. So let's open up the data folder, and in here I'm going to create a new enumeration just to keep things a little bit cleaner, and we can use the switch on enum nodes in the blueprint. We could use a few booleans, but this is just a little bit cleaner. So let's call this our enum AI weapon types, for example, and open it up. So in here, I'm just going to add two enumerators. The first one is going to be trace, and the second one is going to be projectile. So we can simply specify what kind of weapon this is. And if you want to be more creative and create all kinds of special weapons, you could add them in here as well. But we're going to start with these two. So we have a trace and a projectile weapon. So now we can finally start looking at primary data assets, and we're going to be using those to set up our weapons. So if you are familiar with a data table but not with data assets, a data asset is kind of like a single row from a data table put into an asset, and that asset holds all the information that you need to set up a weapon, for example. So let's just create one, and then it's a little bit easier to understand probably. So we're going to right click, go to the blueprint class. We're going to expand all classes, and we want to look for primary data asset. So we can simply select it over here and create it. So let's call this our primary data asset AI weapon, and open it up. So it looks really similar to a normal blueprint, and in here we're simply going to set up a bunch of variables that we need to define our weapon. So let's just add them. The first one is going to be our weapon mesh. So that's going to be a skeletal mesh over here. The second one we need is a muzzle socket, and that's going to be a name variable. Then we're also going to add the muzzle flash fx in here, and that's a particle system. So over here, the lower one, particle system. Then we are going to add our weapon type enumeration. So let's call this our weapon type, and then enter our AI weapon type enum. And then we're going to add a few variables specific to certain weapons. So we can add a projectile class in here, for example, if we are using a projectile weapon. So that's going to be an actor, but then it's a class reference and not an object reference. So make sure you select the purple one over here. Nope. And then in case we want to create a shotgun, I'm going to add a boolean for that. So is shotgun, turn it into a bool, and we want a number to specify how many pellets or bullets that shotgun is going to fire in one shot. So let's call this our pellet count, for example, and that's going to be an integer. So we're not going to be using all of these variables right away, but this will make it a little bit easier to understand how this system is going to work. So for the projectile class, I'm going to give it a category, so it's just a little bit cleaner to work with. And I'm going to do the same thing for the shotgun. So call this our shotgun category. And also add the pellet count in there, for example. So this is what we're going to start with. This is our primary data asset. Compile and save this one and close it down. And now we want to create the actual data assets that we're going to be using. So we want to right click again, but this time we need to go to miscellaneous. And over here, select the data asset. Then we can select our primary data asset from this list. So it should be in here, primary data asset AI weapon. Select that one. And let's call this our blueprint data asset AI weapon and then rifle. And first of all, let me show you that it's pretty important that you create this from the miscellaneous category over here. So you can also go to blueprint class and then simply search for your primary data asset weapon and select this one. So if you create it over here, it actually shows up and it also has the correct icon, but it's blue. And over here you can see it's not a data asset. So this doesn't work. You need to make sure you create it through the miscellaneous section and then actually select a data asset. So let's delete this one. And let's open up the data asset that we created. So in here we can simply set everything up just like in a data table. Instead of it being a row, now it's a blueprint. So let's select a mesh for this weapon. That's going to be the assault rifle. The muzzle socket, we can grab that from the skeleton. So if we open it up, we're going to use the muzzle flash socket over here. So let's copy and paste the name. Then we have the actual muzzle flash FX. So that's our assault rifle muzzle flash. It's going to be a trace weapon, so that's fine. And because it's a trace weapon, we don't need to set up a projectile class. And it's not a shotgun, so we don't need to worry about this also. So we can save this data asset and we don't need the skeleton anymore either. So let's close all of this down. And let's create a second data asset for a shotgun, for example. So we can simply duplicate this one and then call this our shotgun. And make sure we change the assets in here. So let's select our shotgun mesh. So the muzzle flash socket is the same. So it's named muzzle flash as well. So that's easy. Then we need to change this one to our shotgun muzzle flash particle system. It's also going to be a trace weapon, so that's fine. And then it's not a projectile because it's a trace weapon. And we gonna enable the shotgun boolean, and then we can set the pellet count over here. So let's make it 8 or something. And we have our shotgun set up as well. So close that one down, and we're gonna keep it at this for now, so we can easily add other weapons later if we want to. So at this point we want to start taking a look at creating the actual component that we're going to add to the character. To add the weapon to our character, we're going to be using a skeletal mesh component, but we're actually going to create that inside of the content browser first. So let's right click, go to blueprint class. And for the all classes, we can simply search for skeletal mesh component. Select it in the list over here. And we're gonna name it something like a blueprint AI weapon component. So this is going to be the base component, and we're gonna create childs from this component, and those will be the actual weapons. So let's open up this component first. We need to make sure in the class defaults we go all the way down and we enable the component replicates flag over here. So this is important for multiplayer. Make sure you do this first. Don't forget this. Component replicates. And then we're going to set up the rest. We're going to add one variable in here, and that's going to be the weapon. And that's going to be our primary data asset AI weapon. So select it over here. And then we can set up event begin play, for example. So if we drag in our weapon, and from the weapon we can get our weapon mesh. So that's simply the variable that we added a little bit earlier. And because this is a skeletal mesh component on its own, we can simply set the skeletal mesh asset for this skeletal mesh component. So set skeletal mesh asset target is self, and then we can plug in the weapon mesh over here. So this will set the correct mesh. And then we're going to create a function for firing the weapon. So we're not going to be using that right away, but just as a little placeholder. So let's create a custom event and call this fire weapon. And for now, we're simply going to spawn the muzzle flash fx in here, and that's going to be it. So let's drag off here and do spawn emitter attached. So we want to attach this emitter to the weapon component. So that's a reference to ourself. Simply hook that up over here, and then we can grab the muzzle flash fx and the attach point name from our weapon primary data asset. So we can drag that in over here and then get our muzzle flash fx, hook that one up to the emitter template, and then get the muzzle socket and hook that one up to the attach point name. And then for the location type, we need to make sure we set it to snap to target, keep the world scale. So this will play our muzzle flash fx. So for now, this is all we're going to do in here. We need to expand the fire weapon function, obviously, but we're going to take a look at that later. So let's close this component, and now we can set up the actual child components that are going to be the weapons. So we're going to right click on the weapon component and create a child component class. So let's call this something like blueprint AI weapon and then simply rifle. We're going to open it up, and all we need to do in here is set the weapon variable that we created. So we want to set it in between these begin play nodes. So before we execute the begin play function on the parent, we want to set the weapon variable so the parent can actually use that variable in the graph that we created a few seconds ago. So because this is a child blueprint, we can simply access the weapon variable if we look for a set weapon. It's in the list over here. So drag it in, plug it in between the two nodes, and we're simply going to select our data asset for the rifle. And that's all we need to do in here. Compile and save it. And now we can simply duplicate this child or create another child from the parent, that doesn't matter. So I'm going to move this blueprint to the weapons folder. This is a weapon that we can actually assign to our character. And then I'm going to duplicate the child, and this is going to be the weapon shotgun. And all we need to do in here is open it up and change the data asset to our shotgun data asset, and that's good to go. So we have a rifle and a shotgun to play around with for now. And now we need to make sure that we add it to our guard character. So let's go to our GDR guard character. And in here, we want to set it up. So the first thing we want to do is create a variable. And that's going to be our weapon. And we want to turn it into our AI weapon component, but a class reference. So select AI weapon component class reference over here. And then on the right side, we're going to make this instance editable and exposed on spawn. So this will make sure we can select a different weapon for each AI that we place in the level or spawn. So we need to spawn the actual component, and we're going to do that at begin play. So right now we have the test for the focus hooked up, so we can simply disconnect this one. So we only have the branch that disables tick for clients, and we don't have anything else on begin play. So these are just for testing. I'm going to move them out of the way. We're going to spawn the component, and we are the server. The component replicates, so we only need to spawn it from the true pin. We're going to drag off here and do an add component by class over here. And if we use this node, we can plug in our class. That's the exposed variable. So hook that up over here. We're going to enable manual attachment. And then we want to promote this to a variable so we can access our weapon easily later. So this is going to be our weapon component. And then we need to attach it. So we're going to drag off here again and attach the component to another component. So component to component, this one. The parent is going to be our character mesh. So we can plug that one in over here. And then we want to attach it to the hand R weapon socket that we created. So let's just go to the skeleton over here and simply copy the name. Go back and paste it in over here. And then we need to set the location rule to snap to target and the rotation rule as well. So this will spawn our weapon mesh component. That should be good to go. And I think we are pretty close to be good to testing this. So there's one important thing you need to do when you are using primary data assets. And that's actually in the project settings. So we want to go to edit project settings. And over here, you want to go to the asset manager tab and expand the little thingy at the top over here. So over here, you need to add the primary data assets that you created for your project. So there are 2 already in here by default. Just leave them. Don't mess around with those. We're going to add the little plus sign and then expand this entry. So over here, we can simply type a name. That's not too important. That's for your own reference. So we can call this like AI weapons, for example. And then we need to select our primary data asset class in here. So that's our PDA AI weapon. Select this one. And because we are going to be using blueprint classes in there, so we're going to be using the projectile class, for example, I'm going to enable the has blueprint class tick box over here. So for every primary data asset that you create, you want to add an entry in here to make sure that all of the assets are being loaded properly. So that's pretty important. Okay, so we can save that. And now we should be pretty good to test this. So let's quickly run a little test to see if this is working. We have our AI guard in the level. If we select it in the details panel, we can now define a weapon for the guard. So let's select our weapon rifle, for example, and then simply start the map. So now the AI should be holding the rifle, and that's working. And if we simply switch it to the shotgun, it should be holding the other weapons. And that's working as well. So, not really too much exciting stuff going on yet, but we have the base for the weapon setup done. And it actually looks a bit better if the AI is holding a weapon. So, yeah, we just needed to get all of this stuff out of the way. There's quite a lot of setup that needs to be done before we get to the actual behavior stuff and that stuff like that, but we'll get there in the end. So now let's talk a little bit about data assets. So especially if you come from data tables, you might be missing the little overview window with all of the rows where you can simply compare values easily and see everything in one window. So if you use data assets, you can kind of do that as well. So if you simply select all of the data assets, then right click and go to Asset Actions. And over here, select Bulk Edit via Property Matrix. Then you will end up with something similar to a data table, but you can actually tell what variables you want in there. So maybe it's even a little bit better. So you can simply pin variables that you want to see. So if I want to see the shotgun and the pellet count and the weapon mesh, for example, I can pin those. And those will show up over here. And I can also simply edit them in here. So this is actually better than a data table because you can get rid of all of the stuff you don't want to see probably. So that's useful if you're using data assets. And now something that's even a little bit more important. It becomes less important to worry about soft object references if you use data assets. So if you're not really familiar with soft and hard object references, a hard object reference is a reference that is loaded into the memory and that is accessible. So for example, if I have a hard reference to a blueprint. Let me see. How can we show this easily? Then I can actually access all the variables on that blueprint. So over here, the weapon component, for example, I can drag it off here, and I can get all of the variables on that weapon component that we added, and I can change them and access everything, stuff like that. If we have a soft object reference, we cannot do that. So before we can actually use a soft object reference to access it or spawn it, for example, we need to use an async load node to load the asset into the memory, and then we can access it. Now, if we use data tables, and I have quickly created a data table to show you. So I've created the data table that simply holds our two weapon data assets in here. So in the end, this data table holds all of the assets for all of our rifle. So if I right click, go to the reference viewer. So in here you will see, as soon as I use the data table inside one of my blueprints, and if we would have a setup, then at some point I would need to add a get table row node in there somewhere. That node references the data table, and that data table references all of the assets in here. So all of the skeletal meshes, all of the muzzle flash affixes, everything for all weapons in the data table. So all of that stuff will be loaded into the memory unless you make those soft object references. If you do that, then you end up with a lot more code because you need to load those manually when you actually need them. So it's a little bit trickier to work with. Now, if we take a look at a data asset, the actual primary data asset over here does not contain any actual references to asset. So there are references to a skeletal mesh class, but there's not actually a skeletal mesh assigned in here that needs to be loaded. So we can reference our primary data asset without making references to any actual assets, and only at the point where we actually enter our data asset. So that's over here, and the data asset references the actual assets that we need for the weapon. So only when we actually use this data asset, those assets will be loaded into the memory. And at that point, you probably need them because otherwise you won't be adding the data asset. So it's a bit more streamlined, and it works a little bit better out of the box without using a lot of soft object references. Although there are still plenty of reasons to be using soft object references, to be honest, but out of the box, this is a little bit better optimized. So yeah, that's what I wanted to get out of the way. I think we have everything covered. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please consider leaving a like, and I'll be back soon for more. Talk to you later, guys. Bye bye.